Jessica, a digital production manager and art director at ECW Press. She oversees the house's audiobook programs, book covers, metadata, sometimes all at once. Since 2016, Jessica has been integral in the launch of ECW Press's audiobook program, which has brought 23 independent publishing houses from around Canada together to produce and distribute 100 audiobooks. And Brendan Ouellette, as digital project manager for Annick Press in Toronto. Brendan works with producers, voice actors, authors, and industry experts to translate print content for kids and teens into exciting audiobooks. Welcome, both of you.
Thanks so much, Cal. Hi, everyone. So in my bio, industry experts were mentioned, and I consider Jessica to be one. Most of the presentation today will be me asking her questions. She helps run Annick's early days audiobook program. Jessica, do you want to start with what do people do with their audiobooks in terms of licensing or production?
So we're going to go over sort of our broad workflow that we came up with at ECW Press. So we're going to talk about everything from the actual production, which we'll get to in the middle, and just sort of what we learned over the last 2 years. So this is going to be a little introductory with hopefully a lot of strategies if you're interested in creating audiobooks at your company or as an individual, strategies that you can use. So what do people do with audiobooks right now in Canada specifically? A very large part of our audiobooks, the rights are sold by the publisher to someone like Audible or Recorded Books, and they then make the audiobook, put it out, and the publisher is no longer involved in that. Another option is the author maybe would retain the rights, and this is something that might have happened before. Now people are much more, book contracts are much more often including audio rights as a major concern. And then because this is Canada, another thing that could happen is that your US parent company could make the audiobook for your Canadian edition. And also not to be ignored are organizations like the CNIB who will make audiobooks for accessibility reasons. And then also you can produce your own audiobooks as a publisher, which is kind of what we're going to be talking about today. But also very often in Canada, they just might not get produced. And that maybe is because the rights just didn't sell, that none of the companies that are buying rights for audiobooks picked up on that title, and maybe the publishing house doesn't have an audiobooks program, or it's not a priority, they don't have the staff to dedicate to it. So hopefully today we can give you some solutions to fix that problem of audiobooks in Canada that aren't being converted into, or print books that aren't being converted into the audio format.
So how do you decide which books to sell the rights for and which to produce in-house or which not to produce at all? So at ECW, the first step that we take is we look at our list for the season and just see what books feel like a natural fit for the audio format. There are some that are just obviously are not an audio top pick, things that are like image-heavy books. Some kids stuff doesn't do well in audio or doesn't do well enough in audio, things that are obvious like poetry or technical things. And then there are other books that they seem like an obvious choice. So almost all fiction seems like an obvious choice to convert to audio, and specifically genre fiction does really well in the audiobook format. So we just look at the list and sort of go book by book and see which ones fit. And then the next question is to ask yourself, if you have the ability to produce your own audiobooks, do you want to produce this yourself or do you want to sell the rights? And often that choice is made by if a rights buyer is interested in buying your rights, then you might just sell them. But there are reasons to, even if you have interest in the rights being purchased, there are reasons why you might want to keep it in-house. And a lot of it has to do with control. So if you have an author who would be a really strong choice as the narrator of the book, you really think that that book should be narrated by the author, maybe you want to keep the rights to that because once you sell the rights, you don't have control over who's cast. And similarly, if your author has like a high personal stake in the book and it's going to have a lot of feelings about how it's made and what it ends up sounding like, and if you have ethical concerns in who's going to be cast. So if you have a book about Indigenous rights and you want to, of course, cast an Indigenous narrator because it's 2019, but you sell the rights, you don't have control over that necessarily. So those are some of the reasons why you might keep it in-house. Also, an important point is do you want to reach the library market with this book? Which usually the answer should be yes. And if the library market is important to you for this title or for you in general, you might not want to consider selling your rights to Audible, for example, because most of the books that you are going to sell rights to Audible are going to end up as an Audible exclusive, and they're not going to end up in libraries, which can be a real problem for the people you're trying to reach. I'm going to pump libraries a few times, so you can clap anytime I do it. So on the other hand, there might be reasons in favor of selling your rights, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that making audiobooks can be very expensive, and it seems daunting and scary. I mentioned genre books do really well in audiobook, but they're also some of the most expensive to produce as far as fiction goes, because you need a specialized narrator who knows how to pronounce crazy made-up words, and they're usually longer, so it's going to length is the number one thing that's going to affect the cost of your audiobook production costs. So a lot of times, even though we definitely want our genre books in audio format, we might sell those rights just because it will save us the headache that is creating a fantasy epic in audio. And in the end, like, people get a little scared of the cost of investing in the cost of creating an audiobook, but the way that we like to look at it is it's the same as sort of the rest of the publishing business, where creating print books is a very expensive and risky move too, but we do it every day. That's what our business is built on. There's going to be books that sell in gangbusters. There's going to be books that maybe don't just barely make up their cost, but you are overall trying to balance your audiobook program the same way that you're balancing your overall list. And hoping that those ones that sell a lot are going to be able to make up for some of your passion projects that maybe have like a more niche audience. So if you are interested in figuring out if something is worth making versus selling the rights, and you want to like start a basic P&L, I'm going to give you some of my secrets of the trade that I've learned in the last couple of years. The first thing you need to know is what a finished hour is, and that's very basically the final runtime of the book. You're not talking about paying people by the hour that they are working. You're talking about paying people by the hour of the final book. And so that's why some of the costs are higher. They sound higher, but that's because several hours are going into that one finished hour. So if you want to know what the finished hours of your book is going to be, you take the word count of your book and divide it by 7,600, and that's going to give you a larger, a more generous finished hours estimate that you can start building your ideas or your pricing on in the beginning. So if you had like a 50,000 word book, it's going to be like a 6.5 hour audiobook or so. And once you know that, you can think about your production budget, which is two major things: the studio cost and the narrator cost. Of course, there's more things to think about. But in Canada, a good baseline is $200 an hour for finished hour for the studio, and for the narrator, $100 per finished hour is the very minimum. You're not going to get anyone less than that, except for maybe the author, who might do it for free. And up, it's more like $200 per finished hour for the narrator for the standard. 100 is very low. 200 is pretty standard, and if you're looking for someone who's a bigger name, it's just going to go up from there. You're also going to have to keep in mind that you're going to spend money for the people's in-house time. You're going to whatever you want to spend on marketing, auditing, which we'll talk about later as well.
Right. Okay. Shall we talk about the market today?
Sure. Let's talk about it quick. So it's much like the ebook market. It's difficult to know because we don't have great reporting. We don't have comprehensive numbers. People don't tell us how much they sell. But we can base our ideas on just your own numbers in-house and some anecdotal information that we have. We know that the market in the US, the retail market, is like Audible all the way over 80% is Audible. And that's connected to what we're doing here, because until Audible launched .ca in 2017, all of the Canadian listeners and the Canadian dollars were reported in that US Audible number. And many Canadian users have not switched to a .ca account. So they're actually, on our side, our numbers for Audible are probably skewed because they're being reported as US. And I'm sure Audible knows who all those people are and where the dollars are coming from, but we don't necessarily know that. But another great way to figure out the market share is to ask listeners where they're listening and how they're listening, which is what BookNet did this last year for the Readers Are Listening report. And right now, if you want to go to we have a graph. This is from the BookNet's Readers Are Listening report from 2018, where listeners acquire audiobooks. It's a bar graph that shows different vendors and how many people responded that they used that vendor. So basically what we're seeing here in this graph is very similar to what we have found in-house, and that is that Audible and Amazon are retail-wise the two big, the one big player. Though there's two bar graphs there making up Audible. I'm sure the Amazon bar also includes people who would go to Amazon and buy a physical CD, but as we know, digital audio is a much bigger market in audio.
Sure.
We also see that libraries in Canada, people want to listen to books at libraries, librarians want to give audiobooks to people, and publishers just have to make sure that they get their audiobooks to those libraries so that can happen, because Canadians love to listen to books. And then other major retailers are who you would expect. You've got Google Play, you've got iTunes, you've got Kobo. So this very much lines up with what we know as well. Oh, and also piracy. YouTube was the second, tied with Amazon at 39%. Thank you, bold answerers who are just like, I just steal it. That's great. I wanted to talk a little bit about what our audiobook program was, which you heard a little bit of in the introduction, and other audio things that we're doing, so you know where I created this workflow we're about to talk about. So our audiobook program evolved because David, our co-publisher, had a growing interest, hearing, of course, all the buzz that was happening in the past few years of around audiobooks being an up-and-coming thing, or something that we should all be paying attention to. And he wanted to know how we, ECW, as a small, medium Canadian independent publisher, we publish 50 titles a year, so we're quite small, and how could we participate, but better yet, how can other publishers like us, smaller publishers, non-multinationals, academic publishers, who don't have the people, who don't have the resources to make audiobooks, they can't build a studio in their offices, how can they get involved? So what we came up with was what we call the 100 Project, which is a very not creative name, but we just use it internally, so sorry. I wasn't there when they came up with that name, which is why it's not that great.
It's well publicized right here.
So yeah, we were working with all other publishers to build the infrastructure in Canada, not just build our knowledge in-house and figure out how to get these books out there, but also there are a lot of voice actors who have no audiobook experience because they're based in Canada and most audiobooks are recorded in the States. There are studios who are really interested in getting into audiobooks, but they don't know who to talk to. So we were building those connections between publishers, between the actors and acting guild, and the studios, to build the infrastructure so that when we do want to make books, then we have all of that there. So that was the project that was referred to in the intro, where we paired with over 20 other publishers, including Annick, and released 100 books. And then we also have the BC publishing houses are doing a very similar project right now, and they've brought us in to consult so that we can tell them what all of our growing pains were, and they can get sort of a head start that we had to slog through when we first started. And we also offer consulting services to any publishers or who are interested in any part of the process. So if you just want help casting your book, if you want help with distribution, you can come to us and we will help you with that. And then the last project I want to talk about is our Bespeak project, which is just ramping up now. It's a project where we're looking to license audio rights for Canadian books that were never made in audio. So for whatever reason, maybe it was because before there were less audiobooks being produced and now the ship has sailed a little bit or something, but they're great Canadian content. People want to read them still, so we're reaching out to other publishers, licensing the rights from them and producing those books. It's going to be a 50-book project, and the first book that we released is Moon of the Crusted Snow, which is an ECW book, which is why it was the first one. It was a lot easier, a lot less negotiating, so we just cranked that one out. So yeah, there should be 49 more to come by the end of 2019. Yeah.
That's great. Okay, so we will move on to talk about production now.
Yes.
And some of the details and some of the steps in the production process. So yeah, what roles do you need to fill to make an audiobook?
So this is the bulk of what we're going to talk about today. What process have we used, and can hopefully maybe you can
learn something from or just criticize in your mind, don't tell me to my face, of how we have decided to do this. So the first step that you want to do is someone in-house or a freelancer or a contractor. You need someone on your team as the publisher or the owner of the content, whether you're an author, to be the in-house knowledge base and the producer. We're going to call them the producer from now on of your book. So it's your go-to person for audio. It should be someone who likes audiobooks, who has listened to hopefully many audiobooks, but at least one. And then also knows the books that you're trying to convert into audio. They can help you decide what book to record, so they can be involved in that step where you're looking at the list and deciding which ones to sell rights to versus produce. And then you want them, even if it's someone who's read the book before, take the time to reread the book from the perspective of it being recorded as an audiobook. Think of each element, how it will translate into an audio format. Think of footnotes, think of charts and visuals. And then also think of the performance. Are there accents in the book that you're going to have to replicate? Is there a lot of dialogue? Is there not a lot of dialogue? Is there a fictional culture you're going to have to create or decide how it sounds? Or more importantly, is there a real culture that you're going to have to do justice to? These are the things they need to think about, and then they should have a plan for how to tackle these challenges. As they read the book, they can come up with that plan and help you decide who to cast. For example, when we worked with Annick, that person was Brendan. He was the go-to person who was overseeing the conversion of their title for audiobooks.
Yeah, so the second project we worked on, the first one was on that slide with all of the different titles. But the second project we just completed, just published last week as a simultaneous print, ebook, and audio version, was a comedian's memoir, Funny You Don't Look Autistic, a comedian's guide to life on the spectrum. And Michael McCreary was, as a stand-up comic, the perfect choice to read his own title. And for those who don't know Annick already, we publish books for young people. We publish picture books. And this is kind of at the upper age limit of who we publish for. So a book for teens with maybe some crossover potential. And the way that we kind of approached teens and made it more friendly for teens was to have a lot of graphic content in the book. That didn't translate so well for audio in some cases. So what we kind of built off of was another opportunity for Michael to tell a joke about how difficult this diagram might be, and pointing people to our website or the audiobook provider's website to look at a supplementary PDF. So it was something that we had to consider at the beginning of the process. We brought the editors back in and had a discussion with them about how to logically map out all of the different steps of something like a flow chart or something like a grid or something like a game. Michael talks about a wheel of fortune to, it's hard to explain a joke backwards, but
do it, lean into it.
Right, the cause of autism, this week's cause of autism, and then he had like a graphic wheel of fortune where, you know, people blame pizza, Canadians, you know, random things for why people have autism. So he was able to talk like a game show host in the audiobook, and it sounded great. It was pretty funny to hear, but the sort of phrenology map of special interests wouldn't have translated so well. So we point people to the supplementary PDF for that.
So yeah, once you have that person in-house, whether it's Brendan or someone that works at your company, you can choose. Once you have your producer doing the development, now it's time to work on casting, which can be either the easiest part of the process or the hardest, depending on what happens. This is a good time to bring in the author if you have access to the author, who's usually an invaluable resource for figuring out what the tone of the book should be, what the person should sound like, how old should the person be, all the different sort of bits and pieces of what the performance should sound like. If it's a fiction book, they'll know even if it's nonfiction, they'll know the characters, they know what people should sound like. And if it's a nonfiction book with like specialized information, they'll be able to pick out if the narrator can pull off sounding like an authoritative voice on this very special topic.
So how to find an actor? At ECW, we have a large database of narrator demos that we put together over the last 2 years. And we worked directly with the acting community and with our acting guild. And what we did was we got a lot of demos for auditions for books, but we would also put together demo days where we would have a whole bunch of actors come in and read different types of books, create demos. They get their demo that they can now give to their voice agent, who can be like, look, they can do audiobooks. And we also get their demo so that we can add it to our database, where we can search for people by gender, by age, by nationality, or accents, or any other features that anything that they're able to do. But if you don't have a database like I do, and you're in Canada, you can go to Actor or Acting Guild. They have a voice bank online, and you can just listen to demos there. You can just contact the voice agents in your area directly, no matter where you live. You just Google what voice agents are in your area and email them and say, I'm looking for someone with this exact type of voice. Can you give me a few options? And they'll all give you lots of options right away, because they're very fast and good at their jobs. If you have something very specialized, you can use a casting agent. We found very quickly, originally we were using a casting agent who would then do all of that work for us. But we found that it was easy enough to just talk to the voice agent ourselves, so it was a cost that we didn't want to take on. But if you have something that's very specialized and you want a very specialized actor, if you want someone from a very particular community, a very particular Indigenous community or something like that, then maybe a casting agent is a good idea, so that your casting process doesn't just take forever. And if you're in Canada, you can ask ECW to help, and you can tap into that database that we've built over the last 2 years. If you're looking to do one book, a few books, a lot of books, email me, jessica@ecwpress.com, and we help with that kind of thing all the time. So once you have your names, the next step is to listen to a few demos. So you want to get them to demo your book, theoretically. You can listen to their demos of other audiobooks and choose based on that. But I find it really helps to have them reading your words, especially when you're bringing the author in. Having the author hear them read their book is really it's going to help a lot for you to choose the right person. So you want to choose an excerpt or a snippet of the book that's very indicative of the difficult content in the book. So if there is this particular accent that you want to make sure you nail because it's in the book a lot, then make sure you choose an excerpt with that. If it's a very dialogue-heavy book and you want to make sure that it's very clear who's talking when, then pick a good dialogue-heavy section. Anything that's difficult, you want to make sure is in that around one-page snippet of the book. And then they can either record it at home and send it to you, which is great. We do that all the time. But the best way to do it is to have an audition day in studio if you can. Especially if you're doing more than one book, you just get a bunch of narrators to come to you over one day. You could do different books and just have them come for 15 minutes into the studio. And it's really useful because if they're sending you their demo from home, you're not hearing all of their mistakes. They're going to edit those out. They're going to give you the most perfect take. But if you get them in the studio, you can see how comfortable they are, and you're recording it the same way that you would record the book, the final book, where you're going to stop them if they make an egregious mistake and get them to start back. So you can see how they deal with that process, how many mistakes they make per page, and that kind of thing. So it's a much more accurate feeling, and I found when I'm casting via auditions, in-person auditions, that I have a lot more, it tends to be more successful, and it's an easier choice. You're like, that's the person. You're going to get your feedback on your demos from your author, from anyone in the process that needs to be involved. If it's an editor, anyone in the company that has stake, maybe your publisher wants to hear it. Get your feedback, and then choosing, it's one of the most important decisions. Like when you're creating a print book, making your cover is a very important decision because it's your first foot forward. Choosing your narrator is a huge choice when it comes to audiobooks. So, and every book is different, so you have to take into account different things. Maybe for some books, like we said, the background of the narrator is the most important thing. For other books, maybe it's a specific accent. Or for other books, maybe it's a lot of different accents, being able to do a passable accent in a lot of different cultures. And for some, it's like nailing emotional dialogue, and for others, it's being able to do technical speak without tripping up all the time. So you figure out what's important to you, and cast your narrator. And once you've worked with their casting agent to see how much worked out that cost, like $100 per finished hour, $200 per finished hour, your producer, your in-house person, should prep the narrator on the tough things. So especially if you're working with new narrators, which is what we did a lot, you need to prep them and tell them what to expect, because some of them don't know. Maybe it's their first audiobook. Some of them don't know that, in fact, you have to read the whole book before you come in to speak it the first time. And not just that, you need to read it and make notes. You need to write out your pronunciations for difficult words. You need to, if you need to, highlight the characters so that you know who's speaking where, so it's very clear what voice you're supposed to be using. A good tip that one of our more experienced narrators gave us was that he likes to record a little snippet of each character so that he can then send it to the publisher and the author and be like, this is my idea of what this person sounds like. He has a little soundbite of a few seconds so that you can comment on it and give feedback, but also he can refer back to it. If that person doesn't speak for 7 chapters, he can be like, what did Caroline sound like again? Okay, right, now I've got it, and he can jump back in. Write your phonetic breakdowns, and if you can, connect your narrator with your author, because this is something that you can do if you're producing your own audiobooks as a publisher or a content holder. You can have the narrator and author hook up and talk, and the author can express what they're trying to do with the book. The narrator has a much more, they're more invested in the content, and they understand, and then all of the nitty-gritty stuff like pronunciations and names, and a good hot tip, go over every name in your acknowledgements, because you forget about acknowledgements, and there's a lot of names and a lot of them are difficult to pronounce. And the last thing is that sometimes the author is the best narrator, and this is happening more and more, especially if the author is like the selling point of the book, if they have a following and a lot of the people who are buying the book are buying it because it's this person's book, if they are naturally a public speaker, and if it's a very personal sort of, if the content is very personal. A lot of authors will want to narrate their books, and maybe they shouldn't, and you should just gently discourage that, possibly by sending them examples of professionals reading their books and then having them listen to themselves. But if you do have a narrator who's a natural speaker, then it can create a really good and personal experience. And we have a little clip of Auntie Donahue. This is we have a slide up of pictures of some of our narrators here. The first one is Auntie Donahue, who's the author of Nobody Cares, reading her own book, you'll hear now, and 2 other narrators, Matthew Edison and Dylan Chiblo, who are in the sound booth, which is very dark and hard to get good pictures of. This is maybe Instagram story worth, not Instagram feed worth pictures here.
The newsletter became the place I could be me and sound like me and write like me and share with the world all the very best Leonardo DiCaprio gifts the internet has to offer. I was finally happy just to be there. And for the first time in years, I didn't give a shit about being important. Which is a relief, because I'm not. None of us are. Nobody's looking at us. Nobody cares. Everybody's obsessed with their own thing. Quickly, the newsletter.
So that's Auntie Donahue reading her own book, and that was like from the introduction. That was like the first 10 minutes she was in the studio. She just jumped right in, very smooth. It was like she'd done it 1,000 times. I was like, I'm just gonna go, you've got this. So now you have your narrator. The next step is, of course, recording the book. You've got to do that at some point. And there's a couple ways to do it. You can work with a studio that has recorded audiobooks before, preferably. And if they can give you some samples of books they've recorded, that's great. If they can tell you that they know what Audible's delivery specs are and that's how they're going to deliver your books, then that's also great. It's a good test to figure out if they know what they're doing. But if you're not into the studio option, because that studio cost that you saw at the beginning was a little too much, there's other options. Amazon has the Amazon Audiobook Creation Exchange, which is where their self-published authors can connect directly with narrators. And the narrator actually acts as the narrator, the engineer, and the producer of the book. It's just them recording the book in their home studios. And this is something that's becoming a lot more common now. And it sounds like a little iffy to just put your book in the hands of one person and then they record it. But there are a lot of really professional voice actors who have created hundreds of books like this in their own homes. And I'm sorry, voice actors who have to have so many skills now, but this is one of the ways that it's changing for voice actors, where they're doing a lot of their work out of their homes. And this kind of recording in your home narrator as the engineer model is being used even in traditional publishing, not just self-publishing, not just one-off. So I think it's something you're going to see more of. but we're talking about studio work. And if you're getting in the studio finally, what you want to have at a minimum, if you're small and you can't, and you can only do the basics, is you need to have an engineer who is well trained and has recorded many audiobooks before, because they are going to be the person who's going to be checking the book and telling the narrator when they make a mistake, stopping and going back and correcting. If you don't have someone there who's going to call out the narrator to say, stop, you need to redo that, your book is going to be a nightmare. It's going to cost you 3 times as much to do, because recording it right the first time is by far the cheapest way to do it. Fixing it later is where it starts to cost you more money. So at minimum, you need a good engineer who knows what he's doing. Otherwise, the best way to do it is to have that in-house expert, your producer, or someone who works for you in the studio who knows the book, who knows what the performance should be. And that person's always going to be better than the engineer who's never read the book, of course. That person who can be like, I don't think you got the intention of the cadence of that sentence. I think it should be more like this. You should have increased the inflection on the end of the sentence. And the narrator will be like, oh, okay. It's very hard to read at the same time as like process the emotional output of what you're reading. So sometimes they'll read something flat that should have been read a different way. And having the person who knows the book be there in the studio is a really great option. I would not recommend the author being in the studio. That can be a disaster. Sometimes they'll ask, and I've had it go okay, and I've also had it go where I said, you shouldn't be here. The session lengths, we like to do shorter sessions, so we like to do like 3 hours at a time, because we find at 3 hours the narrator starts making more mistakes. So instead of doing one book over a long, like a full day, we'd rather do like a session for one book in the morning, a session for a different book in the evening and afternoon. So we have multiple books going in one day instead of just pushing that narrator to the limits, but you can do it all in a longer session if you need to. So once you're recorded, the post-production, really quickly, engineer's going to edit it, they're going to give you a proof, and the next step is auditing it. Auditing is really just a word that you can swap in for proofing. You're proofing your audiobook, and there should be 2 stages, ideally, of this. One is happening at the studio that you're not involved in, and their engineers are listening to it from a technical point of view. They're listening for distortions. They can hear and understand when something, an edit has been made, and they can hear a little bit that hasn't been completely edited smoothly. So they're listening for those very technical things. They've got a really good audio setup. But you, if as a publisher, you want to be doing an edit that's more of an editorial proofread. So you're listening for mistakes, of course, if they've misread something, if they changed any of the meaning of the book through their performance or through the words that they've used. And then you're also looking for those little mistakes that the engineer would also be looking for, but you're probably going to have not as good headphones as they do. But do get a good pair of headphones. And this should maybe be not the person who is in the studio, because that person's already listened to it once. So have a fresh set of ears. It could be an intern, it could be a freelancer. So that's another cost if you're going to pay a freelancer. But anyone can really do it. Just give them a little bit of training. And then lastly, you're going to get the engineer will take all of the feedback. They're going to possibly bring the narrator back in for pickups, hopefully as few as possible, because the less the better. And the pickups is them just re-recording their mistakes. And then they're going to put that all together and create the final files. That's called mastering, and give you your final files. What do those final files look like? You're going to want to get, for me, I found what you want to get is an MP3 version and a WAV version at least. A WAV is the lossless version of the file, so it's a bigger file, but it's better quality. MP3s are lossy, but a lot of people take MP3s. Some people only want WAV, some people only, as far as vendors go, some people only want MP3. Some people can take both, doesn't matter. Maybe you listened to Wendy Reed's talk in this room before about standardizing things a little bit more. Audible has some specific requirements, and it's very similar / the same as the requirements they tell their ACX members. That's that Audiobook Creation Exchange. So if you want to know what the basics are, you can just look up their ACX requirements, and that's going to give you sort of the best practice for what they accept. And I find if you work to Audible, unfortunately, if you work to Audible, a lot of the other vendors, that it's not a problem. They all take the same kind of structure. They all have very similar requirements. So major things is that they should be broken down into files by chapter or part if your book is long. If it's a short book, like if you were at the Learner Publishing thing at ebook craft, if it's a short book, of course, it can be one file. But if you have like a novel or something and it has chapters, you need to break it up by parts. And that includes like, even if they're just saying part 1, that should be a file by itself, even though it's only 2 seconds long. And then the next chapter. So you also need to have an opening and closing credits. You can squeak your book through without it, but people get confused, and Audible and other vendors hate it when you don't have opening and closing credits. Your opening credits would just be title, author, narrator, and then you can proceed with the book. And your closing credits is more of a copyright page. It's like when you do the legal speak, when you talk about production credits and grants and rights and all of that stuff. And then there are some like more technical aspects of the files that maybe you should familiarize yourself with if you're the person that's managing these assets. So you should be able to know what the sample rate is, what the bit depth is, that kind of thing. Be able to figure out how to look that thing up. And if you are managing assets, maybe something like Adobe Media Encoder, Adobe Audition, or Audacity would be great.
So we want to go over distribution pretty quickly.
Yeah. So distribution, I think we can maybe just skip right to the metadata section.
Sure, that's good.
Basically, you want to distribute to all the major retailers, and we can do that. We distribute our own books. For some reason, we decided, why don't we just also distribute audiobooks? So if you need help or have questions about distributing to specific vendors or distributing it all, you can ask. But there are some pieces of metadata that you're going to want to figure out a place to store in your systems, because it's separate from what your print book would have. So that's your audio ISBN, your narrator names. You can store narrator bios, but I find no one uses them for anything, so I don't really bother with it. Abridged versus unabridged edition, everyone wants to know, and no one wants abridged editions. You'll get 0 stars in your ratings if your book is abridged. Runtime, you want to store your runtime in minutes and be able to convert it to hours, minutes, or seconds, depending on what people want. Any supplementary material, if you have a supplementary PDF, some vendors can accept the supplementary PDF and offer it to their customers, but many can't. You maybe have different territory rights for the audio edition. Maybe you have a different pub date for the audio edition. And if you do, make sure that you put the pub date of when that audiobook is actually going on sale, so that some people will put the print date even though the audiobook is coming out at a different time. You want to put the audiobook date, please, so that booksellers and librarians see your book coming up as a new book that's coming out. Pricing, you can be as complex or simple as you want. We do some basic comp research for comparable titles. It's about a 30% markup from the print book often if you're doing traditional publishing. And you want to think about library pricing. Please don't price your audiobooks at $100 so libraries won't buy it. We do a small markup for libraries, but I think our library prices are very reasonable because we want librarians to be able to find our books, buy our books, and offer them to their customers. Okay, well, thank you guys. Sorry I talked so fast.